Good evening. I'm Bradlee Graham. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and on behalf of the entire staff, welcome. It does feel a bit nostalgic to be introducing Sally Quinn and her new memoir. She's someone I met when I first came to Washington more than 40 years ago to work at the Washington Post. And Sally's been a prominent presence on the Washington scene for about half a century now. In that time, she's had a number of job titles and or life roles: journalist, television commentator, author, renowned hostess, social arbiter in the nation's capital, a longtime wife of the legendary editor Ben Bradlee, a religion columnist, Washington insider, and devoted mother of son Quinn, who has dealt mightily with a genetic disorder. In sum, Sally has been an enduring standout in this town, an original, and she tells her unique story in her new book, Finding Magic. Initially, as she explains in the prologue, she hadn't intended to write a memoir, but more work about creating and moderating the online forum On Faith, a conversation about religion that she launched with John Meacham in 2006. But Ben's death 3 years ago and the process of grieving that followed led Sally to look back and try to understand the meaning of her own life. And so she penned a memoir, but one viewed through a spiritual lens. Because, as she writes, although she had thought of herself from an early age as an atheist, even an angry atheist, she's come over time to recognize how full of faith she really is. For a long time, too, she's believed in magic, and much of the coverage about this book so far has fixated on Sally's startling revelations about her belief in the occult and some earlier efforts to cast hexes on 3 people who subsequently died. No doubt she'll address that this evening. In the acknowledgments, she does recall asking her personal assistant, Jody Evans, whether Jody found anything in the book that was over the top. Jody said, laughing, "That's just you." The book does cover a lot of ground, and its many anecdotes and insights do make for a fascinating read. It's a heartfelt, illuminating, reflective journey through a remarkable life marked by success and setback, by great love and searing loss. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sally Quinn.
Well, thank you, Brad. I think Brad's pretty much wrapped it up there. Jody Evans is here, as is Ev Small, who worked with me on the book, and Lucy Shackelford. And I do have in the acknowledgments that Ev and I worked very closely together for a long time, and I put in the acknowledgments that anything in the book that is completely over the top or outrageous, I swear to you that Ev tried to get me to take it out. So it is not her fault. And as Brad said, I actually, Mark Talber, my publisher, is here tonight. He asked me to write a memoir about starting On Faith, a religion website, and I signed a book contract several years before I even started writing. And then when Ben started his decline, my husband, into dementia, I just didn't have it in me to do anything. And the last week and a half of his life, everybody was coming to say goodbye to Ben. He didn't know that because he didn't realize he was dying. But I was just exhausted because he had a hard time keeping conversation going. And so I was having to sort of serve drinks and hors d'oeuvres and keep the conversation up. And I just couldn't do it anymore. And Ben was getting really tired too. So I decided that I would not see anyone else again. I'd turn everyone away. And I was resolute, and the phone rang, and it was Ev Small. And Ev said, you know, I knew her vaguely, but Ben knew her really well because they'd worked together at the Post. And she said, I've got this wonderful picture of Ben and Mrs. Graham, and could I come by and see Ben and give you the picture? And I started to say no, and then something made me say yes. I don't know why. And then I put the phone down. I thought, why did I do that? So Ev came over, and Ben was there. He was thrilled to see her. We all had a drink. He was laughing and talking, and she brought the picture. And she had worked with Mrs. Graham on her book, Kay Graham, for 15 years. And I said to Ev, by the way, would you at all be interested in helping me with my book? And Ev said, I really don't think so. You know, I've worked with somebody else, and now it's time for me to do something on my own. And so I said, okay, and I sort of forgot about it. And then Ben died a week and so later. And it was only a couple weeks after the funeral that Ev called me up, and she said, I'd love to come by and just talk to you about the book. And so she came by, and it was on a Tuesday at 11, and we talked for 2 hours. And she said, well, why don't I come back and talk to you next Tuesday? And that started Ev working with me Tuesdays with Sally, you know, from 11 to 1 for 2 years, and then toward the end, sort of like 24/7. I talk about it in the acknowledgments how we used to have a drink about 7:30 at night when we were wrapping it up, and then suddenly it was 6:30, and then it was 5:30, and I knew I had to finish the book when at 4:30 I started looking at the clock to see if it was time for another drink. But anyway, Ev really got me through this book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to read, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to read. And I don't know whether any of you saw the excerpt about Ben's getting Alzheimer's that ran in the Washington Post this week, but I decided not to try to read anything about Ben's decline or his death because I didn't think I could get through it. And so I'm going to start by saying that when I did start writing the book, I wrote about Ben's decline and death first because I needed to get that out. And I still had no idea what I was going to write. But I realized at some point that it wasn't going to be a book about starting the website because that just didn't interest me. What I started writing, and I just started writing these stories about things in my life that had been, that had some importance to me, that were transcendent in some way or magical in some way, or that had and had deeper or profound meaning. And so I went through all of these and I started out by writing about my childhood in Statesboro, Georgia, which is where all the famous voodoo hexes things come from. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about hexes anybody wants to afterward. But I'll just read you a little bit about Statesboro. My belief in the occult started with my earliest memories in Savannah, Georgia, where my mother, Sarah Betty Williams, was from and where I was born. Savannah is a magical place. I think it's the moss. Moss hangs everywhere, pale gray and twisted, limp and slightly foreboding, but mysterious and enticing at the same time. The romance of the moss cannot be exaggerated. There always seems to be a place to hide. It feels dangerous, and a sense of the occult permeates the atmosphere. One can believe anything when in Savannah. I'm not a graveyard lover, but there is nothing like the moss-draped Bonaventure Cemetery where some of my relatives are buried. It is the most deliciously spooky place I've ever been. I do believe in souls, and at times I actually felt them when I was visiting. They're just out there waiting to be admired. My mother's family was from Statesboro, Georgia, about 60 miles inland. Mother had spent her summers there as a child, and we spent our summers there when my father, Bill Quinn, was off at war, first in Germany during World War II, and then again before he returned from the Korean War. It was in Statesboro that my beliefs were formed. My mother was part of the MacDougall clan, Scots who had immigrated to America in the 18th century and settled first in North Carolina, then followed their kinsmen and the lucrative turpentine trade down to Statesboro, a small town on the way to Atlanta. The first MacDougalls established a plantation outside of town in a tiny village called Adabel, after one of my ancestors. These Scots were mystics, believers in the magic of the stones, time travel, and psychic phenomena. My great-aunt Ruth was one of them. She embraced all those qualities and beliefs. Ruth was the grande dame of Statesboro, a pillar of the community despite her unfortunate marriage to a roving hustler named Roy Beaver. She was short with a round, sweet face, apple cheeks, brown curly hair, and soft brown eyes, and she had a sympathetic smile with a slight overbite. She wore silk dresses with lace collars and pearls and sensible shoes. She looked exactly like what she was, the nice Presbyterian lady who played the organ in church every Sunday. She did not look like a woman steeped in occultism, which she also was. A wonderful storyteller, she knew all the family lore. Belief in magic and our Scottish heritage were woven into our lives in Statesboro. We had a number of ghosts at the McDougall house. Family lore had it that whenever any one of the McDougalls died, a ghost would pull chains across the floor of the long upstairs hallway, which ran the length of the house from porch to porch, as did the downstairs hallway. The rattling of the chains would keep everyone awake all night. Sometimes it would go on for nights at a time. The night my great-uncle Outland McDougall died, the noise from the rattling chains lacked to have scared us all to kingdom come. That summer when Daddy was away, my great-uncle Horace died, and everyone in the house heard the chains making crashing noises up and down the halls. I heard them too. At least I think I heard them. There was a huge thunderstorm with lightning crashing around us, and I got in bed with my mother. I could hear people sobbing and wailing all night until I finally fell asleep at dawn the next morning. The next morning, Ruth showed us scratch marks on the floor in the upstairs hallway. As it was the Deep South in the early 1940s, all the domestic staff were black. Many of them were descendants of slaves who had worked the McDougall plantation. They were Baptist. They went to the church across town where they lived in the shanties that Uncle Roy owned. They were all Christians, just like Ruth, but they had another religion too. Just as Ruth was a devotee of Scottish mysticism, they were adherents of voodoo, which they practiced regularly. One Sunday, we woke up around 6 a.m. to smell of frying bacon. Ruth put on her chenille bathrobe and slippers, as did my mother, and they went into the kitchen to see what was going on. Nobody was there. The bacon was cooking, the coffee was percolating, there were eggs in the pan, and the grits were bubbling. Orange juice was out and poured in the glasses. Ruth turned off the burners, and she and my mother waited until the staff showed up an hour later. The house staff had no idea who could have done this. They were terrified. Ruth was completely sanguine. She calmed them down. It was just the ghost, she told them, and they clearly meant no harm. One summer when we were visiting, we came in for breakfast and found Ruth sitting on the divan in the parlor holding a shawl and weeping. She had dreamed that night of her mother, she told us, and her mother asked to speak to her. She wanted to let Ruth know that though she had heart problems, her mother was watching over her. Her mother told her that she would leave Ruth something in the parlor so that she would believe her. When Ruth went into the front room, she found her mother's shawl, the one she had been buried in, on the divan. So that was what I called my embedded religion. And I think when when people are brought up Catholic or whatever your religion is that you're brought up with, and you believe that if you sin, you're going to burn in hell. And then you grow up and you think, well, that's all nonsense. And yet you do something wrong and you think, maybe. And so this was the occultism as well as Christianity was part of my embedded religion, so that it was always there in the back of my mind. But I never thought of it as a legitimate religion. And so it was something that we all understood and accepted, but just didn't talk about in the open. That gauzy hot summer in Statesboro came to an end. Daddy came home. The war was over. This is World War II. He had been promoted to a full colonel, or a bird colonel as they were called in the Army. He was a war hero. He had been in intelligence, or G2 in Army lingo, and had distinguished himself in the war. He had been a part of Operation Dragoon and at the Allied landing in the south of France, had helped capture and interrogate Hermann Goering, and had arrived in Dachau the day after liberation. He had a staff photographer with him who had taken a huge number of pictures, some of which are in the Holocaust Museum today. He had them made up into scrapbooks that he brought home with him, full of the infamous pictures. Ditches filled with naked skeletal creatures who once must have been humans, all dead. Hundreds of shriveled faces of emaciated people of indeterminate sex in striped uniforms staring blankly into space, as though they had no idea what was happening. A few, but very few, slightly animated or slightly dazed. The Americans in uniform looked almost equally shocked. When Daddy came back from Germany, we moved to Washington and bought a house in Arlington, Virginia, near the Pentagon in Arlington Cemetery. He kept the scrapbooks in a small study off the living room. I was 4 years old when I found them. They were in black cloth covers with strings holding them together. I don't remember how many. No writing on them, no explanations, just the pictures. That was enough. The pictures seared into my mind. I was mesmerized. I had no idea what I was seeing. He and my mother had not discussed the war with me. All I knew was that the Nazis were very bad. I was too young to read the papers. The radio was just background noise to me, and we didn't have TV then. I kept looking at the bodies. Why were they all piled up in a ditch? How did they die? They must have starved to death. I saw the glazed-eyed people in their uniforms. What were they doing? What were the soldiers doing? Why were they all standing around? Why did Daddy have these awful pictures in the first place? For a while, I didn't tell him I had seen them. But when he wasn't there and my mother wasn't looking, I would run into the study, slide the scrapbooks out of my semi-hidden space in the bookcase, and pore over them with curiosity, horror, and disbelief. I felt as if I were doing something wrong, that I shouldn't be looking at them, but I was so disturbed by them, I couldn't stop. And finally, I got the courage to ask my mother about the photographs. She was upset that I had found them. She waited until my father came home, and they went into another room to talk. When they came out, my father put me on his lap, and we went through the scrapbooks together. He described what the pictures were and what had happened. He answered all my questions. There was only silence. After a bit, I asked him a last question. Did God know about this? Yes, he said, God knows about everything. Then why didn't he do anything about it? That's part of the mystery of God, my father answered. I got up and ran to my room, threw myself on the bed, and began to cry. I was hysterical. I couldn't stop. My whole world had been shattered. God, kind, loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, had let this happen. The God I prayed to every night on my knees had let this happen. Those people must have been praying too. Their children must have been praying. God didn't answer their prayers. He let these horrible things happen to them. He let these evil people do these things. If he couldn't or wouldn't protect them, why should I expect him to protect me? Why should I think he loves me, cares about me, wants me to be happy? In fact, if there really were a God, the God I believed in, he wouldn't have allowed this. No loving God would be responsible for this. And suddenly, it became clear to me. There was no God. There couldn't be. It was impossible. I stopped crying. It was hard to accept, but I had to. I quit saying my prayers. There was no God. That's how I became an atheist. And that was reinforced when I went to Japan. My father was then stationed in Korea. And when he was sent off to Korea, I got very sick, and I ended up in the hospital. I couldn't eat. For about 8 months, I was on intravenous. And at one point, I was dying. They called my father back to the hospital because they knew that I wasn't going to last more than a couple of days. And as it turned out, my father came back and I recuperated. And I think ultimately that it was psychosomatic, that my illness was really about being separated from him and being worried about him. We were not allowed to see our parents while we were in the hospital. That was a pediatrician rule, and so I didn't get to see my parents for months at a time. Anyway, after my father went back to Korea, I got sick again, and so they decided to evacuate me and my mother and my sister and brother.
You're not talking into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better? Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. So did you hear what I said about being in the hospital in Tokyo? Okay, I was in the hospital in Tokyo and for about 8 months when my father was in Korea, and I was so sick I couldn't eat. I was on intravenous, and then they thought I was dying, and I had emergency surgery, and my father came back to be there while I was dying, and then I recuperated. But as soon as he went back to Korea, I got sick again, and they couldn't do anything for me, and they decided I was such an acute case that they evacuated me back to Texas. It was decided that I needed better care, and we received orders that I was to be evacuated to Brooke Army Medical Center at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. My mother, sister, and brother were to come as well. What they didn't tell us was that we would be traveling on a hospital plane with a group of the most severely wounded soldiers. I can't decide which circle of hell in Dante's Inferno best describes that trip. The plane was filled with litters 3 rows across and 5 high. We were all assigned litters. There was no place to sit or even sit up. The plane was packed with young soldiers, most of them on IVs, as was I, many of them minus one or several limbs. There were severely burned soldiers who were barely recognizable. Blood was everywhere, dripping from the top litters down onto the lower ones, running along the floor in rivulets, soaked into towels and bandages, on people's hands and arms and all over the nurses' clothes. I remember the blood well, particularly its smell, but mostly I remember the sobbing, shrieking, wailing, gasping, moaning, begging. It never stopped. "Please, God, help me," they cried. "Please make the pain go away. Please don't let me die." Or almost as frequently, "Please let me die." Most heartbreaking of all were the soldiers' anguish cries for their mothers. My mother spent most of the trip walking, or rather sliding through the blood up and down the aisles, trying to comfort them. She stroked their foreheads if they weren't burned. She kissed them gently. She held their hands. She listened to their pleas. She told them that they were loved. She wrote down the names of family and friends in case they died, promising to write. She lit their cigarettes and brought them chocolates if they could smoke or eat. Most of them smoked. They asked her to pray for them. She did. I wanted to. I tried to. All I felt was anger. Again, I was thinking, how could God let this happen? What good would praying do? I knew a lot of them would die anyway, and they did. They were dying right and left. The orderlies would come, zip them up in body bags, and take them to who knows where on the plane. Quite a few litters were empty when we arrived in San Antonio. I was frustrated because I was too sick and too weak to walk up and down the aisle and help them out. But my sister Donna, only 7 years old at the time, did what she could, talking to the ones on the bottom litters and even lighting their cigarettes too. She was like a little mascot. 10 years or so ago, she attended a reunion of my father's regiment, the Buffaloes, and a much older man came up to her and said he remembered her. He had been in one of those litters, and she had lit his cigarette. So I ended up being an army brat traveling around the world. I went to Smith College. I had a lot of interesting experiences in college, and but I was after I got out of college, I was sort of floundering around, and I couldn't find a job that I liked. And I went with my parents to Germany for a couple of years, and that was great. I traveled around a lot. I came back, but then I got really desperate, and so I was thinking that maybe I should get married because at Smith, our motto was a ring by spring, and here I was at about almost 29 years old. I was an old maid, and I was living with my parents, and it was really getting humiliating. But these two things happened all at once. There was a reading. I majored in theater at Smith, and I wanted to be an actress, which didn't work out. But there was a reading for the play Joseph Heller's We Bombed in New Haven, at downtown theater, and so I went to try out for the lead of the play, and I had at one point a couple of years earlier met Ben Bradlee when I went into the Washington Post to apply for a job as a secretary for the editor of the editorial page, and I'd met Ben, and it was like the Sun King. I couldn't believe it, how gorgeous he was, but he was Ben Bradlee. So anyway, I went to the reading, to the play. I auditioned. A few days later, I got 2 phone calls back to back. The first one was from the director of the play. "Congratulations," he said, "you got the part." I was euphoric. We agreed to meet for the first reading. The second call was from a voice I recognized the instant I heard it. "This is Ben Bradlee," he said. "I'm the editor of the Washington Post." Well, I certainly remembered who he was. "I'd like to talk to you about being a party reporter for the new style section." Ben had invented the style section a few months earlier, which was later copied by newspapers throughout the world. I was nervous but excited. We agreed to meet for an interview. I went to see Ben first before I met with the director, but not before I had done my homework. I found out he was a Virgo. That made all the difference. If I hadn't known that, I likely would have approached the interview entirely differently. In an interview in the Washingtonian several years later, I was asked if knowing people's birth signs helped when I was doing interviews with people. Oh, absolutely, I was quoted by the reporter. I'm not an astrology freak, far from it, but it's certainly more fun than religion. So I laid my Virgo number on them. Actually, it was him I laid the number on, and I still can't believe I said that to a reporter. Virgos are dutiful, modest, noble, humble, powerful, achievers, and good communicators. They can see into people and detect their motives. They can sometimes be judgmental. They are decent and cannot stand dishonesty. They are not overly emotional and are not overly flirtatious. So armed with this information, my Virgo number was in fact not a number. I was totally honest and straightforward. I didn't brag or exaggerate my background or achievements. Of the latter, I made it clear that I really didn't have any to speak of. I didn't flirt, and I dressed in a very ladylike manner. I wore a pale aqua silk jersey shirtwaist dress, pale stockings, cream-colored lizard shoes with matching bag, real pearls and pearl earrings, and the pièce de résistance, white gloves. Ladies still wore white gloves in 1969. At least this one did. My mouth was dry, my heart was pounding, my hands perspiring, and it wasn't that I was nervous about the job interview. I really didn't have high expectations. Besides, I had the acting job in my pocket. It was Ben. We probably spent half an hour together. A lot of it was in the form of a dance, a sort of competitive repartee. I was giving as good as I got, and neither one of us wanted to be bested. It was pretty cheeky of me now that I think about it. After all, he was the editor of the paper and also 20 years my senior. And I don't know where I got the courage to go at him the way I did, but he clearly enjoyed it, encouraged it even, and it felt exactly right. And it still did 43 years later, right up until a few days before he died, when I tried to get him to do something he didn't want to do, and he gave me the finger. Can you show me something you've written, he asked. I've never written anything in my life, I replied. Nobody's perfect, he said. You're hired. Without hesitation, I called the director and told him I couldn't take the part. Talk about the road not taken. Maybe the gods were beginning to show me the way. So I found this wonderful astrologer named Caroline Casey, who I recommend to everyone, even if you don't believe it. If you go to Caroline, she's a genius and she's a total intellectual, and you will suddenly turn around on this. But there was a wonderful profile of her in Outlook, but I started going to her and got involved in learning about astrology. But also, it was a book that I read. I'm not a student of astrology. I don't know how to read a chart. What I do understand is sun signs and the often stunning accuracy of them from a personal standpoint. The person who really turned me on to astrology was Linda Goodman, who came out with a blockbuster in 1968 called Sun Signs. A subtitle on later editions reads, How to Really Know Your Husband, Your Wife, Your Lover, Your Child, Your Boss, Your Employee, Yourself Through Astrology. The book was thoroughly entertaining and mind-altering in many ways. Never have I read anything that was so detailed and so accurate about those closest to me, never mind myself. One of the amazing aspects of Goodman's first book was that all the verses before the chapters was from Lewis Carroll. This seemed to be quite a coincidence, but although I believe in coincidences, I view it more as synchronicity. As I have mentioned, I had always been an Alice in Wonderland devotee and had played Alice in my senior year in high school. Before we now was Alice speaking to me again in each of the epigraphs as I devoured every page over and over again. I keep a copy of Linda's sun signs on my bedside table today and also her love signs and refer to them both frequently, not just for me, but for all of my friends, even those who profess not to believe in astrology. For a long time, it was my Bible. And when I would go to see Caroline Casey, Ben, my husband, who thought it was completely ridiculous, and I would come back from the reading and he would say, "What'd she say about me?" He couldn't stand it. I believe reading one's astrological chart can be at least as valuable as therapy, sometimes more so, assuming you have a good astrologer. Astrology has always helped me in dealing with family, friends, bosses, and coworkers, but never has it been as useful as when I am interviewing people, particularly doing profiles. I always look up a person's sign before I see them, and it generally gives me a huge advantage. For one thing, as a theater major at Smith, I practice the Stanislavski Method. What that means simply is that you don't play the character, you become the character. And I use that approach in interviewing. I learn a person's sign, and then I take on the characteristics of that sign. It gives me a huge affinity for the interviewers because I feel I can empathize with them. It's not fake. I really do empathize with them, and it definitely seems to work for me. And people did open up to me in ways they normally didn't, and I was always being asked how I got people to say things they said to me when they did. I never told them I read their signs first. They might have thought I was crazy. And maybe they still will, but I don't care anymore. My motto these days is whatever works. And that's certainly my motto for religious beliefs or the lack of beliefs. I don't call anyone else crazy, including those who don't have any beliefs at all. I expect the same respect for me. Christopher Hitchens, well known for being an adamant atheist, once confided to me that he actually read his daily horoscope and considered it good luck if he found a penny. And Richard Dawkins, also a well-known atheist, told me that he's afraid to step on a crack for fear of breaking his mother's back, and that he is terrified of haunted houses and would never spend the night in one. Ben and I had a son, Quinn Bradlee, who's now 35, and Quinn was born with a heart defect and was in the hospital right after he died for 3 months. And I mean, right after he was born for 3 months. And he came very close to dying a number of times. And I write about this because I lived in the hospital with him for those 3 months. And they couldn't operate on him right away because he was too small and they thought that he wouldn't make it through. And finally, they did operate on him. And he survived, obviously, but he had severe learning disabilities as a child and was sick all the time. Until he was about 16, I spent a lot of my time, much of my time, living in Children's Hospital and the lab school, because he went to special schools all of his life. And, you know, he didn't have any friends. He had a really difficult time in school. And we went to therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists, and it was daunting. And I have to say Ben was the most extraordinary father because he admired Quinn more than anybody he's ever admired because Quinn was so resilient. I mean, he just kept on going and going and going no matter how sick he was and what kind of pain he was in. But at one point, I was really just kind of wiped out. And so I decided to go to this health spa in California. And Ben insisted that I go because he said I just really needed to get away. I was under such pressure. So I went. And when I got there, they told me about this thing called the Labyrinth. And they had just put in a labyrinth, which is a sort of a meditation tool. It's a circle that you walk. And there's one on the floor of Chartres Cathedral, which I've walked and actually taken a piece of stone. And Ben built me a labyrinth in our house in the country, which I walk every time I'm down there. And there's one in Grace Cathedral. And this one was the same. It was modeled after the one in Chartres Cathedral. And so a couple of years before, we had an unpleasant experience with a psychiatrist who told us that Quinn had been tested, would never graduate, never go to high school, that he would never have a job, that he would never have friends, that he would never have a relationship, and that he should be put into an institution. And I just fell apart, and Quinn was about 7, 8 years old, and I couldn't bear it. But I just was so angry because in my mother's gut, I just knew that she was wrong. So it was right before that, I had another experience that confirmed my belief in Quinn's special talents. And it began when I went to this spa in California. And I'd never heard of the Labyrinth. It just, to me, meant a maze. And it was described as a circle where you walk to the center and back, and it's used as a meditation tool. And I declined. It sounded too hokey and new agey for me. However, one of the counselors said that a lot of businessmen had been there for Men's Week, and many of them who walked it swore it had changed their lives. And that intrigued me. So a day or two later, before dinner, I decided to go up to the grove alone. It was on this sort of grove of wild oak trees, live oak trees, apart from the spa. The sun was beginning to set, my favorite time of day. It was warm with a slight breeze rustling the branches. The trees were casting their shadows on the labyrinth. It felt instantly mystical to me. I stood for a long time at the entrance and concentrated on Quinn. Quinn was around 6 or 7 at the time and had so many medical and learning problems that I was constantly distraught. I almost never left him, but Ben had been insistent that I really needed to get away, and he was right. Slowly I began to follow the winding path into the center of the labyrinth. When I reached it, the evening was so still that my senses were heightened, and I could hear twigs breaking and birds twittering and the wind rustling. I sat down in the middle cross-legged, my back turned from the entrance, and began to meditate. For a long time, I kept my eyes closed, and then I looked up. What I saw astonished me. It seemed to clarify everything that I was wondering about. I hadn't noticed before, but right in front of me, surrounded by the oaks, was a magnificent evergreen tree with wide-spreading branches that seemed to be reaching out to embrace me. It was so much more beautiful than all the other trees. And suddenly I saw Quinn as the evergreen tree. He was alone in the midst of all these other trees, but he was the most gorgeous tree of all. And despite all his problems and his differences, he stood out among them as the special, beautiful tree. And I just sat there in the center of the labyrinth thinking of my precious child and how unique he was in this world and how much I loved him. And it also made me realize that I needn't worry about him so much anymore. He was going to be just fine. He was going to be Quinn. So Quinn grew and thrived, and Ben then developed dementia. He was diagnosed about 8 years before he actually died, and I didn't tell anybody. We didn't tell anybody because for a long time it wasn't that noticeable. He'd forget his keys or he would forget something, but at about 2 years before he died, he really did start to take a downward slide, and I had to sort of tell people then, and I really had to protect him. I didn't, if we went out to dinner, I would always put him next to me, and I had to bathe him. He got to the point where he couldn't take care of himself, and he couldn't bathe himself, and he'd forgotten how to brush his teeth. And I didn't want to have anybody else take care of him because I wanted to take care of him myself, which was probably the most spiritual thing I ever did in my entire life. It was a complete blessing to be able to be with him, and I think that at that time in my life, in our lives, that both of us in some very odd way were happier together than we'd ever been before. And I know that he was happy. And he died in my arms after about 3 days lying in bed with him. And I can't go talk about this anymore, but after Ben died, I had a funeral, and that year was something that I could not have expected. Nothing outside of my bubble of grief had any effect on me. I felt like the famous bubble boy. I could hear people talking to me, I could see them, I could respond, but they were all outside. Somebody emailed me the poem Funeral Blues by W.H. Auden. These 4 lines were especially wrenching. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. How could I have been so wrong? How could I ever really not have taken the reality to heart that Ben would die? I guess I didn't believe it because he was so fully alive, so invincible. I was lost without him. What followed Ben's death was truly a year of mourning, deep and unpredictable and intense. It was a sad and surreal year when I alternated between feeling totally numb and devoid of emotion and experiencing moods that fluctuated daily or even hourly, from highs to lows and lower lows. Certainly friends and family were there for me and helped hold me up. Focusing on the quotidian was another big comfort. Those everyday moments somehow, in their very ordinariness, reinforced the idea I could actually take small steps that would eventually move me forward. For a time I felt untethered, like George Clooney in the movie Gravity, as he floated off into space. I've gone from lamentations to saudade, a Portuguese word that has become one of my favorites and seems to have been created just for people who have experienced great losses. Saudade, a longing for someone you love who is absent, or as Wikipedia defines it, a deep emotional state of nostalgic or profound melancholy longing for an absent something or someone that one loves. My days have been filled with saudade. It's different from grief. It permeates your bones. The Greeks had a word for it too, emeros, or yearning. As the grief dissipates, saudade remains. As there is a difference between grief and depression, there is a difference between yearning and depression. I have not felt depressed since Ben died. Sad, but not depressed. That sadness has morphed into saudade. It wasn't until, so I tell you some of these stories here, but it wasn't until I finished writing the book that I wrote the prologue and then the epilogue. And the reason is because the stories started adding up. And as I said, I didn't really know what I was trying to write in the beginning. I didn't know what I wanted to say, and I didn't know what conclusion I was going to come to. And so then I sat down, and it was like, this is in the sort of last bits, the last month or two, that it sort of all came to me, and I began to sort of see what it was that I was trying to write. Once I would have said that most of us are looking for answers. In my quest for meaning, understanding, wisdom, and certainly a sense of the divine, I found that the questions were equally, if not more important than the answers. For example, some believe that we have one life, and others believe that we have many. That's simply one of the questions that arise in any discussion of faith. I believe it's legitimate to explore all the possibilities. The stories I focused on here were events and stages in my life when answers were elusive and questions abounded. It was by continuing to ask questions that I moved along my path. Each story had a moment where meaning crept in, where there was some revelation, a flash of recognition of something consequential and illuminating. Often these epiphanies, fleeting as they may have been, were incredibly important to me, but I didn't understand why at the time. Only in retrospect has their significance become clearer. I'm fascinated by memory, by what our minds store, by how and why we remember certain happenings and feelings, but not others. How could my siblings and I remember things so differently? What was it about these stories that resonated with me, that made them somehow sacred? What did I learn from them? What questions drove me to ask about these episodes in my life? How did they contribute to my spirituality? What magic did I find there? Myriad questions again, but I have faith that if I keep embracing the questions, I'll always be moving forward. As Rainer Maria Rilke suggested, live your questions now, and perhaps even without knowing it, you will live along some distant day into your answers. And in the epilogue, I wrote, people often ask how I would define myself religiously, what I believe, what label fits me. I've tried on a lot of positions, beliefs, denominations, and faiths over the years. At one point, I even wrote that dancing was my religion. Somewhat embarrassing now, but then it didn't seem far from the truth. In the end, none of these identifiers I've taken on felt like a perfect fit, and I've discarded most of them. The labels seeker and searcher don't work for me. I think we're all seeking meaning in life, so it doesn't tell anyone much. I used to like the idea of being a somethingist. At one time, I adopted the label when I thought people were using it to acknowledge that they believed in something but couldn't make a definitive statement about what that something or something might be. I fell into that grouping in certain respects. Later, I saw a definition of somethingist in the Urban Dictionary as a person who defines their beliefs in a somewhat annoying manner. And I began to think that this label was a little too cute and way too simplistic. Religious humanist or secular humanist doesn't really describe who I am either, and neither atheist nor agnostic works for me. Agnostic never has, in part because if an agnostic is a person who believes that nothing is known or can be known about the existence of God, then that covers most of us to begin with. An atheist is someone who denies the existence of God. And from a very young age, I clung to the idea that I was a confirmed atheist. As I've written, though, I came to understand that even if I was uncertain about the existence of God, I was never someone who didn't believe. I believed in many things, certainly in magic and mystery and meaning. I was not a doubter about the importance of gratitude. I was not skeptical about the beauty of all living things. I was not doubtful about the power of love, grace, and passion. We cannot live without grace, and we should never live without passion, in love, in work, in our beliefs. And I believe that life inherently has great meaning, potentially for everyone. I'm not negative, not pessimistic, not a cynic. I am definitely not a nihilist. If I had to choose one word for where I am spiritually and philosophically at this moment in my life, it would be transcendentalist. The transcendentalist, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, adopts the whole connection of spiritual doctrine. He believes in miracle, in the perpetual openness of the human mind to the new influx of light and power. He believes in inspiration and in ecstasy. When I first read that quote, I felt I could not have described myself better in terms of spiritual doctrine, and I believe that there are miracles. The reality is that in the end, I have my own religion. I made it up, helped along by a close reading of Thomas More's lovely book, A Religion of One's Own. Nobody has the same religion. At one point, Moore writes, the more traditions I study and borrow from, the deeper my spiritual life becomes. And so it is with me. Emerson, again, when he met friends he hadn't seen for a long while, had the habit of asking, "What has become clear to you since last we met?" And there are two things that have become clear to me. One of them, psychiatrist George Vaillant directed what is known as a grant study, a study undertaken at Harvard as part of a larger study of adult development at Harvard Medical School. A number of men from the classes of 39 through 44, including Ben, my husband, and Jack Kennedy, were followed throughout their lives since college. After writing several books on the subject, Vaillant concluded recently that the study showed one thing: happiness equals love, full stop. And the thing that I think is the most important thing that I've learned that has become clear to me is one of the many things I've learned is that you can't seek happiness to find meaning. You have to seek meaning to find happiness. Thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions now. If you want to ask something, please come up to that mic over there or that mic over there.
Tim Towell.
Hi, Sally. Great to see you again. I have a less spiritual question. It's about Washington, D.C., where you've been for years and years and years, and where I've been since the Kennedy administration. And as we said in there, I first met you, we finally figured it out in 1968, where as a Foreign Service officer back from Bolivia, I was trying to show off for my boss. If you don't show off for your boss in this town, you're finished. And I invited you to come with me to the late Fred Chapin's reception. And you were a star, of course. I did get promoted, by the way. Washington, the capital of the United States of America, the capital of the world. And now there's a guy down there that calls it the swamp. So my question, is this Washington that I remember and identify with you, with serious, adult, polite persons? Everett McKinley Dirksen talking to a Democrat, I took notes, like Tip O'Neill or a Chuck Percy. Even Jesse Helms was polite when he was doing what he did.
Well, I can answer that.
And now everybody says we're in the swamp and we're ugly, we're ill-bred, we don't like each other. I like this guy. And we behave badly and we cannot govern anymore. Are they right, or should we still maintain the standards that we grew up with?
Well, I do write about Washington quite a bit in the book. And one of the things I say is that Washington is a spiritual hardship post. You know, Washington has always been a difficult town, but it has changed enormously, and it's been gradual because I used to say the airplane changed everything, because once people were able to fly out and go to their home districts and have their families live there, they weren't here, they didn't live here, they didn't know each other, the kids didn't go to the same schools, they didn't go to churches, they didn't see, there was no camaraderie. And when I first started covering parties, the Republicans and Democrats were all at the same dinners, and they'd fight during the day, and at 5 o'clock they'd break out the bourbon and all sit around and have drinks. And those days are gone, and they've been gone for a long time. And I think that one of the things about Washington, too, is that a lot of people come here. I was in Boston recently, and this young man was running for Congress, and he's a former Navy SEAL and very idealistic. And he was there was something sort of heartbreaking about how idealistic he was. And I said to a friend of mine, I wonder how long it'll take him before he becomes cynical. And so, I mean, people do come here, a lot of people come here wanting to do the best and wanting to save the country and make the country great again and all of that kind of thing. And then they learn that you have to make compromises. And one of the things you learn about Washington is that good people sometimes have to do bad things to stay in power, to keep power, to wield power. And I think this current administration, I think it's probably the most toxic, most poisonous atmosphere that I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, everybody hates everybody, and I described it the other day as it's sort of like the air. You're breathing in carbon monoxide, but you can't see it and you can't smell it. You just know it's killing you. There is something just really painful about watching what's going on in the country and watching people go at each other and seeing the level of discourse just plummet the way it has. But I'm very optimistic. I don't think this is going to last, and I think that at some point there's going to be an antidote to this, that some people are going to say, this is not what we want. We don't want this in our country. We don't want to live this way. And we do want the country to work, and we want a return to decency and goodness and kindness. And I believe that the American people are good people and are kind and are decent. And I don't think that anything else is going to prevail.
Shortly after Obama's election, you wrote an article for the Washington Post strongly recommending that the Obamas join the congregation at the Washington Cathedral. Are you still a member of that congregation?
Well, I love the Cathedral. I think that the Cathedral is probably one of the most transcendent buildings I've ever been to. And I don't go every Sunday, but I do go. Often I'll go during the week and just sit there and sort of meditate. My son was married there. My father was buried there. My husband's funeral was there. So it's a building that has enormous amount of importance to me spiritually. I mean, I just find that when I'm in there, that there is something about it that makes me feel somehow in touch with the divine. I just feel a certain transcendence in that building. And I, because it is the National Cathedral, I thought that would be a good place for the Obamas to go. And because the church is always, it doesn't really have much of a congregation because in some ways it is non-denominational. And so they're always worried about money and about kind of the congregation and having members. And so I just thought if the president chose to go there for church and worship, that it would be a wonderful thing for the community and for the country and for the presidency. But they didn't listen to me.
I'm really taken with your title, Finding Magic, and I have two questions regarding it. How into the writing process did you find the title, and what factors led to it? And I loved your readings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, I've always believed in magic, and so I actually was having lunch with a friend of mine, Frank Foer, who is also a writer and whose pub date is also tomorrow. And he was editor of the New Republic, and he's a very smart guy. And I was sitting talking to him a couple of years ago and telling him what the book was about. And I started telling him about my Southern background and the cultural background and all of that. And he said, but that's, this is what it is. This is what the book is about. Because in the end, I think that all religion is about magic. And, you can call it whatever you want. Most people most people will take more seriously or give more legitimacy to the Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, because they are organized religions. But the whole idea of anything that's magic, people sort of shy away from, and they don't feel that it's legitimate. And so I started thinking about this and thinking, but Christ walked on water. You know, he rose from the dead. He turned water into wine. He fed the multitudes with a loaf and, and Muhammad took dictation from God, to write the Quran. I mean, the Hindu gods, there are many gods. I mean, all of these religions are magic because you have to have faith to believe them. Because there's nobody, as I said, my favorite bumper sticker is, I don't know and you don't either, I mean, you have to have a certain faith to believe something. And it's not, I mean, the thing about magic is, it's not that you have to see it to believe it. You have to believe it to see it. And so I suddenly realized that these things in my life, because I think that my life is constantly filled with meaning. And I think we all are looking for meaning. We're all looking for some sense of the divine in our lives, or something that's transcendent, something that's larger than ourselves. And I feel that with magic, I find magic every single day in my life. And I mean, somebody had a dinner for me the other night. I love ritual. And I talk about this in my book. I used to hate ritual, because I thought it was mawkish and sort of sentimental and overly self-important and all that. And now rituals are everything to me. I mean, they're just, and one of my favorite rituals is to have people for dinner. I mean, I love sitting around my dinner table and having candles and wine and breaking bread and having great conversation. And I want my friends, my guests, to leave and sort of levitate when they leave. I want them to leave my house feeling affirmed and honored and happy and good about themselves. And that is a ritual that I love. And there's magic in that. And when somebody had a book party for me the other night, and I said, this is magic. These things, I mean, breastfeeding Quinn when he was little was just the most magical thing that I ever did in my life. I mean, just there, but it's in the daily life. It's in the quotidian. If you just look for it and you say, and I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish, but if you look for things that give your life meaning, just little things, then just heart leaps up when something wonderful happens, and you just think, oh my God, this is magical. I mean, my son just has gotten engaged, and his fiancée and her 5-year-old child moved in last weekend, and their house is attached to mine, and they have a little 1-year-old dog, Teddy Roosevelt, who's a little poodle. And so I was in the kitchen having breakfast last Sunday morning, and all of a sudden this little 5-year-old comes darting in with a mask on and darts around the table and runs around and hides behind the kitchen counter with Teddy Roosevelt following her around, and then out she goes. And I thought, that's magic. That was just a magical moment. It just made me feel so happy and so good. And I, just being with friends and of course nothing ever can substitute for love. And certainly my marriage to Ben was magical. And we were together 43 years, and it was filled with magic the whole time, and probably toward the end, probably more than any other time. We had the most magical time together, even until the moment he died. And I would love to have that again. I don't know whether I ever will or not, but when you've had that in your life, it's really hard to let go of it. I mean, because love really is the most important thing, and how you love is the most important thing you can do in your life.
We have time for one more question.
Well, I know Quinn has thrived, and so I'm happy to ask this question. What is he doing now? What is his life like?
He works for the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and he's now 35, and he has a website called friendsofquinn.com for young adults with learning disabilities. And it's doing very well. He's really happy with his work, and he does give speeches, and he occasionally will do television. And recently he called up the head of HBO, Richard Plepler, and he said, I think that we should do a documentary about my dad. And Plepler said, hey, that's a great idea, let's do it. And so they did it. And Quinn got a title of co-producer, and he got a salary, and he worked on it, and they've been working on it for almost a year, and it's coming out November the 8th. And he's in it, and I'm in it, and I have not seen it yet, but I hear it's fantastic. But Quinn's an idea machine. He's got so many things he wants to do, and he's a very happy, affectionate person.
That's great. Well, we'll all watch.
Thank you.